There are buildings in this world that do not make sense, not because we do not understand architecture, not because we have lost the blueprints. They do not make sense because the story we have been told about who built them does not match what is standing in front of us. And tonight we are going inside the most guarded secret in Russian history. Not the revolution, not Rasputin, not even the execution of the Romanov family. We are talking about something they never taught you in school. Subscribe and stay with me. Let me show you a mystery. The Romanov deception. Russia's last royal family did not build those palaces. They inherited them. Let us start with a simple question that has a very uncomfortable answer. If you walked into the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg right now, you would walk through doors that are 11, 12, sometimes 13 feet high. Pause on that, 11 feet. That is taller than two grown men standing on each other's shoulders. Now ask yourself why. The official historians will tell you it was aesthetic, a display of power. An architectural choice by the Empress Elizabeth and later Catherine the Great to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Okay, fine, but here is where it stops being a simple question and starts being a problem. Those doors and the entire structural engineering of those palaces would require a level of precision stone cutting, load distribution, and material knowledge that we today, with our computer-controlled machines and structural engineering software, would struggle to replicate affordably. And we are supposed to believe this was done in the early 1700s, by serfs, with chisels. Catherine's palace in Tsarskoye Selo is the breathtaking Baroque structure outside St. Petersburg, covered in literally 100 kilograms of gold on its exterior facade. According to official records, it was substantially built under Empress Elizabeth between 1748 and 1756. 8 years. Let me tell you what 8 years means in context. The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona has been under continuous construction with modern equipment since 1882. That is over 140 years, and it is still not finished. The Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, took 6 years with 12,000 workers using the most advanced construction technology on the planet. Catherine's palace took 8 years. In 18th century Russia, a country where 80% of the population were illiterate serfs who were legally the property of their landowners. I am not saying it is impossible. I am saying that when the math does not add up, you have to ask who is doing the math and why. Now here is where this gets truly dark. The Romanov dynasty officially began in 1613 when Mikhail Romanov was crowned Tsar. Russia at that point was a war-shattered, famine-devastated nation, just emerging from something called the Time of Troubles. 15 years of civil war, foreign invasion, and collapsed governance. This was not a civilization capable of engineering marvels. And yet within less than a century under this same dynasty, Russia suddenly has some of the most technically sophisticated architecture on the face of the earth. No gradual development, no transitional structures showing any learning curve, no surviving workshops, no technical manuals, no trade schools, just suddenly masterpieces. Where did the knowledge come from? The answer might destroy everything you think you know about Russian history. Before we go further, we need to establish something that the mainstream history community treats like an embarrassing relative at a dinner party. Something you acknowledge exists, but nobody wants to actually discuss. On virtually every major European map from the 1600s and 1700s, maps produced by the most respected cartographers in the world, maps used by kings and naval commanders and explorers, there is a civilization marked across the entirety of northern and central Asia. It is labeled consistently in multiple languages as Tartaria, not a vague tribal region, not a blank space labeled unknown, a named, bordered, recognized civilization. The 1747 edition of the Encyclopédie, arguably the most important intellectual document of the Enlightenment, dedicates substantial space to Tartaria and describes it as the largest country in the world. The largest country in the world, and then within roughly 100 years it vanishes. From the maps, from the encyclopedias, from the history books. The official explanation is that Tartaria was never really one civilization, just a European catch-all term for various Turkic and Mongolic tribal peoples across the Eurasian steppe. That is the dismissal. That is how academics end the conversation. But here is what they cannot dismiss as easily: the architectural fingerprints. Across the entire former Tartarian territory from St. Petersburg in the west to Vladivostok in the east, from Kazan to Samarkand, you find a specific consistent architectural language. Massive load-bearing archways, unusually high doorframes, thick perfectly dressed stone walls, octagonal towers, advanced hydraulic systems. Ornate tilework that required kilns and firing techniques we only rediscovered in the modern era. The same architectural language showing up in structures attributed to wildly different dynasties in wildly different centuries across thousands of miles. That kind of consistency does not come from coincidence. That comes from a civilization with a unified technical tradition. And that is when you have to ask the question that changes everything. What if the Romanovs did not build those palaces? What if they moved into them? Here is a theory that is gaining serious traction, not on the lunatic fringe, but among independent historians, architectural researchers, and an increasingly vocal community of people who study what is called the mud flood hypothesis and the broader Tartarian civilization model. The theory goes like this. Sometime in the late 16th or early 17th century, a catastrophic event, possibly multiple events, struck the northern hemisphere. Some researchers point to massive flooding. Others to an atmospheric catastrophe. Some to what they call a reset, a deliberate or accidental civilizational collapse. The evidence they cite includes something genuinely strange. Buildings across Russia, Central Asia, and Europe whose ground floors are underground. Not basements, ground floors, first floors, with windows, with fireplaces, buried under 6 to 10 feet of sediment. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, officially built between 1818 and 1858, has its original decorative windows and architectural detailing below the current street level. Meaning either the current street was raised dramatically after construction or the building is far, far older than 1818, and it is not alone. Across St. Petersburg the pattern repeats, buildings whose lower sections are buried, whose so-called basements have ornate ceilings and decorative moldings that no one installs in a basement, buildings that look to anyone paying attention like the top halves of much larger, much older structures. Now enter the Romanovs. The dynasty rises to power in 1613 in the chaos following the time of troubles. Mikhail Romanov is crowned not because of military conquest or demonstrated genius, but because the noble families of Russia needed a compromise candidate, a weak young controllable figurehead. He was 16 years old, and within that first generation of Romanov rule something remarkable happens. They begin commissioning elaborate palaces and churches, many of which architectural historians will quietly admit show construction techniques and stylistic elements that predate the Romanovs themselves, predate them by centuries. The Cathedral of the Annunciation inside the Moscow Kremlin, officially dated to 1484, shows features consistent with what researchers identify as Tartarian construction. The specific arch geometry, the unusual thickness of the walls, the orientation of the structure relative to astronomical alignments. 1484 is already before the Romanovs, but independent researchers argue the actual foundation is far older, that what we are looking at was renovated and reattributed. The historical equivalent of buying an old house, putting fresh paint on it, and telling your guests you built it yourself. This is the Romanov play, not conquerors, not builders, inheritors who rewrote the inheritance documents. And here is where the Peter the Great question becomes absolutely crucial, because Peter is the linchpin of the entire deception. Peter the Great, officially born 1672, officially built St. Petersburg from scratch on a swamp in 1703, officially transformed Russia from a medieval backwater into a modern European empire through sheer force of will and genius. That is the story, that is the brand. But let us look at what St. Petersburg actually is as an engineering project, and you tell me if built on a swamp in 1703 by a Tsar who had never studied city planning makes any sense at all. St. Petersburg contains within its historic center alone over 300 bridges, hundreds of kilometers of granite embankment lining the canals and the Neva River, granite that was quarried, transporting, cut, and fitted with millimeter precision. The Winter Palace has 1,786 rooms. The Peterhof complex, the so-called Russian Versailles, has an outdoor fountain system of over 150 fountains that operates purely on gravitational water pressure. No pumps, no electricity, no mechanical assistance whatsoever. It was designed so perfectly that it still operates today 300 years later without a single pump. The Peterhof fountain system required the construction of a 22-kilometer canal, a series of reservoirs at precise elevations, and a distribution network through the palace grounds that could deliver thousands of gallons per minute to 150 outlets simultaneously, all calibrated to maintain the correct pressure at each individual fountain. This is not 1714 engineering. This is not any era's engineering achieved casually. The hydraulic engineering of the Peterhof system is comparable to Roman aqueduct engineering at its absolute peak, the kind of knowledge that was supposedly lost during the Dark Ages and only rediscovered gradually during the Renaissance. So how did Peter's engineers in a country that had been in political chaos for a century not only have this knowledge, but execute it flawlessly on their very first try? They did not. The evidence suggests they did not build it at all. What Peter did, and this is the move that historians have completely missed or deliberately avoided, is that he traveled through Europe, yes, he studied shipbuilding, yes, he hired foreign craftsmen, yes, But what he also did, what the historical record shows glimpses of if you know where to look, is that he documented existing infrastructure. He mapped it, he catalogued it. He hired foreign experts not to build new things, but to explain to him how things that already existed actually worked. The construction of St. Petersburg may have been in significant part the excavation, restoration, and reattribution of structures that already existed. Structures built by the civilization that held this territory before the Romanovs. Structures built by Tartaria. And if that is true, if the Winter Palace, Catherine's Palace, Peterhof, if those are Tartarian structures that the Romanovs cleaned up and moved into and put their names on, then the last question becomes the most terrifying one of all. What happened to the people who actually built them? This is where the theory closes the circle. And it closes it with something that happened not in 1703, not in 1762, but in 1917. The Russian Revolution, officially a workers' uprising. The inevitable result of class tensions, World War I casualties, food shortages, and the incompetence of the last Tsar. And all of those things were real. The suffering was real. The incompetence was real. But revolutions need financing. They need organization. They need people who know which archives to seize first. And the Bolsheviks in the first weeks of the revolution did something remarkable. They did not just seize political power. They seized the historical archives. Within months of the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had nationalized every major archive, library, and document collection in Russia. They created entirely new historical institutions. They rewrote textbooks. They renamed cities. They destroyed churches, not just as anti-religious policy, but systematically targeting the oldest structures. The ones whose architecture told a different story. In Kazan, a city in the heart of what was once the Tartarian heartland, Soviet authorities conducted extensive demolitions of the old city center in the name of modernization. What was lost in those demolitions has never been fully catalogued. In Samarkand, in Tashkent, in city after city, across the former Tartarian territory, the same pattern repeated. Soviet urban renewal destroying the oldest structures, replacing them with concrete blocks and renaming everything. Not the behavior of people trying to build a new future. The behavior of people trying to erase an old one. And then the Romanovs themselves. In July 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed in the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg. The official story is clean. The Bolsheviks eliminated a political threat, but there is a detail that the official story glosses over. The execution was unusually secretive. Even within the Bolshevik leadership, there was disagreement about whether it was ordered by Lenin or was a local decision. The bodies were hidden, disfigured, and buried in a location that was not publicly confirmed until 1991, 73 years of hiding a grave. Why, if the Romanovs were simply an eliminated political threat, why the secrecy? Why the disfigurement? Why the decades of cover-up? Unless the Romanovs knew something. Unless their family, which had occupied these Tartarian palaces for 300 years, had institutional knowledge about what those buildings really were, about what the real history of that territory was. Unless silencing them permanently was about more than just politics. The last dynasty to sit on the Tartarian throne did not build the throne. They stole it. And the people who overthrew them wanted to make sure no one ever found out that the throne existed in the first place. I want to be honest with you here because this is the kind of subject where it is easy to get swept up. Is every element of the Tartarian theory proven? No. Historians will correctly point out that many of the anomalies have conventional explanations, that maps of Tartaria reflected European ignorance as much as geopolitical reality, that buildings do get buried over time by accumulated sediment and deliberate landfill. These are fair points. But fair points do not explain 11-foot doors. Fair points do not explain a gravity-fed fountain system with 150 outlets that still works perfectly after 300 years. Fair points do not explain why the ground floors of St. Petersburg's most iconic buildings are underground. Fair points do not explain how a civilization emerging from 15 years of civil war and famine instantly produced some of the most technically sophisticated architecture in human history with no transitional period, no surviving schools, no technical documentation, and no learning curve whatsoever. The official history of the Romanovs is a story about genius and ambition and European influence. But what if it is actually a story about inheritance, about moving into rooms that were already furnished, about placing your family crest above a door that someone else built, someone whose name has been systematically erased from every map, every archive, every history book on the planet? The Winter Palace has 1,786 rooms. Somewhere in those rooms behind those 13-foot doors, the truth might still be waiting. They just made sure you would never think to look. If this video opened a door for you, and yes, that pun was absolutely intended, then hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. The comment section is open. Tear this apart, tell me I am wrong, or tell me what you have found that I missed. That is how this works. I will see you in the next one.